Secretary, you gave us an assurance yesterday that the sanctions area of your website was up to date. I have been spending some time on your website recently, and I noticed there a significant section about the oil price cap compliance and enforcement, and see that you have issued an alert. It's updated as of February 2024. There's also guidance as to how to report any breaches of the OPC. Can you give us an indication, have you had any reports of breaches of the OPC?
I'll ask Ms Heckscher to assist the committee.
Good morning, Senator. Julie Heckscher, First Assistant Secretary of the Regulatory and Legal Policy Division. Apologies, I'm very high up from the microphone. I don't have information on whether or not we've had specific information on breaches of the oil cap. I can take it on notice, but I would note that generally we wouldn't provide information specifically about particular reports of breaches. Because we take action on any breach advice that we get together with other agencies, including, for example, ABF, AFP, etc., and they're likely to be under investigation.
Sure, and we don't need details, but it is common practice across a range of parliamentary committees, even the PJCIS, to give the fact that a breach has occurred and perhaps the number of breaches without any identifying information. So at that level, are you able to provide any information to the committee now?
I'm not able to provide you with information now, Senator, but I'm happy to take that on notice.
Thank you. Could you also tell us, has there been any reports from any of our international partners about breaches of the oil price cap?
I don't have any specific information on specific breaches, but I can tell you that there is an awful lot of engagement with like-minded partners internationally on concerns generally about attempts to avoid, contravene, etc., various of the sanctions that are imposed in relation to Russia and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there is certainly a lot of work underway internationally to both share information and consider options for responding to those reports of contraventions.
And is the intent that our responses, not just on breaches of OPC, but more broadly, are aligned with international partners?
We generally, from a compliance perspective, and you'd appreciate that compliance with sanctions is a high priority for us and other countries, that we both share information when we are aware of breaches and also share options, strategies, etc., for responding to them. So I can assure you that we do work very closely with partners on options to ensure that sanctions are complied with.
So as I look through the long list of Russian individuals and entities that have been sanctioned or assets have been frozen, I am drawn to the legislative response in the US about the potential use of frozen assets or income streams from them, and similar work in the EU and the UK. I'm aware also that the supporters of Ukraine network, for example, which includes a range of former Prime Ministers, business union leaders, etc., have called for similar measures here. So what steps has DFAT taken to explore options that Australia would have to take similar measures to what we have seen in the US and other partners?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, this issue has been getting quite a lot of media attention and public attention, as you note. And there have been some developments in recent weeks, both, as you mentioned, the development of legislation in potential legislation in the US. It hasn't got through any houses as yet, as far as I understand it. Also, recently, EU, there was an announcement in the EU of, in principle, agreement to take forward measures to make available what they call windfall profits on frozen assets. There's also been some discussion amongst the G7. Australia participates in something called REPO, which is also referred to on the web pages of the sanctions, which is Russian elites. I've temporarily Proxies and Oligarchs Task Force, and Australia has been participating in that along with the UK, Germany, France, Canada, Japan, US, Italy, EU for some time, and it is actually a mechanism, a task force through which we share information, and as part of that task force we have been involved with discussions on options in relation to sanctions and frozen assets. You're probably aware that the issue of frozen assets, whether that be sovereign Russian assets or private Russian assets, is quite complex. There's quite a lot of legal issues around those, the question of seizing those assets, both international legal issues as well as domestic legal issues. In the press, it's also sort of noted where most of those frozen assets lie, frozen Russian assets. A significant amount, according to media reporting, countries don't tend to report on how much exactly they potentially have within their jurisdictions. But according to the media reporting, quite a lot of the frozen Russian assets, for example, are in Belgium, in the Euroclear facility, that's Russian central bank assets, elsewhere, UK, US, etc. For Australia, in fact, because the bilateral economic relationship had largely shrunk, had deteriorated quite a lot even before Russia invaded Ukraine and the sanctions were imposed, actually there were very few Russian assets in Australia at the time that those sanctions were imposed. Our best estimates are, it's more likely to be the hundreds of millions in Australia rather than billions. There'll be a comparatively small amount held in bank accounts, and in Australia they tend to be bank accounts that are not interest earning. So from our perspective, comparatively, we don't have a lot of frozen assets in our jurisdiction. There is no capacity, no provision in the sanctions legislation to seize assets. We have provisions in our sanctions legislation to freeze assets, but not to seize assets. So there is no legislative provision in the sanctions legislation to enable us to do that. Now, whilst this is a matter for AGD, I don't think that there are many provisions generally within Australian law to actually seize assets. I think the proceeds of crime legislation may have a provision for it, and there are constitutional issues around seizing assets that would have to be worked through. So for Australia, we don't currently have any legislative provisions that would enable us to seize assets. Some complexity around whether or not we could seize it, and there is a question about how many assets we actually have. But from our perspective, we are certainly involved in discussions. We're being briefed by our like-minded partners who are looking at these issues and which do have some significant frozen assets. And so hopefully that answers the questions that you have, Senator.
Well, it answers in part. It has also raised some others. How frequently are you meeting with international partners and what level?
So you can imagine that not many of them come here, so we actually have to go there. But we have a lot of conversations that take place virtually. There have been, over the last year, a lot of working group level discussions. Our sanctions officials take part in, I can't recall how often it is, but at points it's been fortnightly or monthly virtual telephone conversations. In addition, we actually have a lot of bilateral engagement with like-minded partners. So it's actually very, very frequently at different levels. So at lower levels it tends to be fortnightly often amongst the sanctions groups. We have an EU bilateral dialogue coming up. We're actually having discussions with partners regularly. I'm off to New Zealand and to Canada relatively soon to have those conversations with partners as well.
Could we come to internal dialogue then? AGD, as you said, obviously has carriage from the legal aspects. Is there any work underway between DFAT and AGD to develop options for government consideration as to what Australia could do and what legislation we may need and what that may look like were we to follow a similar path to being proposed by the US and EU?
Not at this stage, Senator.
Okay, so no work has been done to understand what the barriers are in Australia?
Well, we, DFAT, have had some consideration of what the barriers are here, but we have not taken that any further at this stage.
I would just make the point in terms of sanctions that we've had to fund just to actually get our sanctions regime up to scratch in terms of enforcement and monitoring. We've had to commit an additional $26+ million because of the state in which it was left. What you're proposing, which would be ultimately a point for AGD, which you can obviously raise with them, Senator, but would be an extension of function, and you would have to, over and above freezing, which obviously has a whole set of other compliance and other constitutional issues.
Sure. The input from DFAT obviously won't go to the detail of the legal side of it, but from DFAT's perspective, is maintenance of a diplomatic relationship with Russia a factor that would slow down your support? Or
No. No.
No? Okay. The collaboration...
In fact, we've imposed... sorry.
Many. I've seen the list.
Yes, I'd rather get into an argument. I just think...
So I did see, Minister, that on the 1st of June you made an announcement regarding joining with ministers from others about the concern around North Korea and Russia, yes. And that relationship undermining peace and security, Russia being obviously the protagonist in terms of the Ukraine conflict, but also a player in the Pacific in our region. There's concern obviously about trade with Russia, but we've also seen, as in from North Korea, but we've also seen reports of trade between Australian entities and Russia. Is DFAT aware of the extent of trade? Are the reports that it's in the order of $1 billion accurate?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Chris Cannon, First Assistant Secretary, Europe Division. Excuse me. I'm aware of the reports, I think, from the Herald Sun on the 27th of May, if that's correct, that report Russia-Australia trade totalled just shy of $1 billion since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just to clarify that article, that figure roughly accounts for all two-way trade since January 2022, so January 2022, before the invasion. So calendar year 2022 and calendar year 2023, and including a lot of trade, obviously, that occurred before Russia's invasion on the 24th of February 2022, and then following shortly after that, as you know, our subsequent implementation of sanctions and trade measures. And to be clear, following the imposition of all of the sanctions and trade measures through 2022 and continuing into 2023 and indeed this year, the actual trade, the two-way trade we're talking about, two-way goods trade with Russia, has declined very markedly indeed by 99%, such that for the 2023 calendar year, we're only looking at, I think it was $14.8 million. That's the 99% decrease compared to a reasonable comparison before the invasion, which would have been calendar year 2021. So the trade has dropped down to next to nothing 2021 calendar year compared to 2023 calendar year.
Sure. So in that period since the invasion, how many sanctions exemptions have been requested from Australian industry, and how many requests has DFAT actioned?
Give me a moment, Senator, just to see if I can find it. So are you talking about permits that we might have given in relation to the Russian sanctions regimes?
So a commercial entity here wants to import or export, do trade with Russia, and approaches you and seeks a permit to operate legally, even though there perhaps is a sanction against some of the things they may be wanting to do. Although I note the list includes everything from power tools to nuclear reactors. I wasn't aware that we exported nuclear reactors, but that's one of the prohibited exports.
Just last minute, Senator, I have to hand the call back to the Leader of the Opposition.
Can I just...
Sure.
Sorry, do you want to finish?
Minister, did you need to add
I
something?
can tell you that we currently have 21 total active permits, that is permits granted in the last 12 months in relation to Russia-Ukraine autonomous sanctions.
Can you give us an indication as to what areas they apply to in terms of the goods that have been sanctioned? That
I don't have that level of detail with me. I'm sure
See
that
what
we
we can get you.
can
We can-
give you general detail.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see what.